Great, thank you. All right, I hope everyone has had a chance to grab some lunch, take a little break, stretch your legs. I'm pleased to introduce Wynne Norton. She's going to be giving a talk on implementation science. And Wynne Norton is a program director for the implementation science team in the office of in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences at the National Cancer Institute. Within the division, she assists with the expansion of research activities in implementation science, focusing on healthcare delivery and de-implementation across the cancer control continuum. And related to de-implementation, Wynne recently co-authored a paper in JCO with David Chambers and Barry Kramer, which is a wonderfully written conceptual piece on de-implementation and cancer care delivery. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I strongly recommend doing so. And also, prior to the meeting, Dr. Norton generously provided a PDF with many readings and resources in the implementation science area, which were distributed to the group by email. If you did not receive this list of resources, please email Brenda McAllister Affleck, email me, email someone on our team, and we will get this information to you. So please join me in welcoming Wynne Norton.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's wonderful. I have not been here at ECOG-ACRIN before, and I'm very impressed and thankful for all the work that you folks are doing. And thanks for being here during your lunch hour. The lunch looks particularly delicious, at least from up here. Just spend a little bit of time today talking about implementation science, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards or later this afternoon, and feel free to contact me as well. Much to my frustration and disappointment at times, I do not have any financial relationships to disclose, and the opinions are mine, not official positions of the NCI, NIH, or the US federal government. So just a quick overview here. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why we need implementation science, why is it important, then going into some definitions and overall concepts and foundational elements of the field, give some examples of the research questions that we see in implementation science, as well as some of the studies that NCI has funded. Give a quick overview of some of the resources, which again, there is a PDF that has been circulating, and I'm happy to send you a copy as well. And then take some comments and questions. I'm very delighted that Ann Geiger and NCI NCORE PI colleagues will be talking about their experiences and some of the opportunities to do in NCORE. So why implementation science? Why did this field come about? Why is it important? The narrative goes that we've spent billions of dollars developing and testing interventions that we know work, efficacy-based interventions, and essentially we have there's quite a delay between when those are developed and when they're actually integrated into different types of care settings. And we have a variety of these different interventions. You can see the NCCN guidelines, behavioral interventions focused on HIV. NCI has RTIPS, which is about 200 different evidence-based practices and programs. And so there is quite the variety there. How many folks, I guess raise your fork, have seen this slide before? Okay. So this is very busy, but I think the take-home message here, it's by Ballas and Boren a while ago, but essentially it tries to illustrate that there is quite a gap between when research is published and the extent to which the percentage of that research is actually integrated into standard of care. And so we see it takes 17 years to turn 14% of original research into the benefit of patient care. And I think we can all agree that that percentage is way too low and that time frame is way too high. Sometimes it's the case, as Grohl and Grimshaw summarized here, that it is quite efficient and effective to publish studies in high-profile journals, and that can sometimes lead to significant practice change. But most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, we need additional efforts to try and integrate those research findings into practice and change the standard of care and improve patient outcomes. So what is implementation science? These are the definitions that NIH uses in the Dissemination and Implementation Research and Health Funding Opportunity Announcement. We're essentially focused on how to study ways to best integrate those evidence-based practices, programs, treatments, interventions, drugs, guidelines, so on and so forth, into healthcare and public health delivery settings. We're looking at different stakeholder groups and really a collaborative approach with patients, providers, organizations, and policymakers to better understand what those barriers are toward integration into different types of settings, and what are some of the strategies that we can leverage to overcome those barriers and move that evidence-based intervention into clinical care and public health settings. So there are a lot of different terms out there in the literature. There was a study by McKibben and colleagues that found 100 different terms in this space. I wouldn't necessarily say that there's one term that's better than the other. It depends on the definition that you're using. But just to emphasize that this really is a scientific endeavor, that we're studying how to implement something versus just implementing something. So this is what we have traditionally thought of as kind of the clinical care pipeline, where we have an evidence-based practice or program, and we look at the health outcomes and assume that if we publish something, if we present something, again, that's necessary to lead to actual practice change. And while, again, that may be the case for certain interventions, oftentimes we see that we need to focus more on how to actually get there. So what are some of the strategies? What are some of the approaches to best integrate those practices into particular settings? Looking at the service outcomes that the IOM defined, as well as these implementation outcomes. So looking at issues around how acceptable is this practice or program, not just to patients, but also a variety of healthcare and public health providers. What is the adoption rate of this practice or program, costs associated with it, and some of these other outcomes. So this is the implementation pathway as we discuss it, and that's about as sophisticated as my PowerPoint presentation gets, so apologies in advance. There are over 61, as recently since this review was done, theories, frameworks, and models, which again, I'm sure is very daunting. There's an interactive website that I encourage you to look at. It's currently being revised as well, that can help guide you in determining what framework might be most helpful for understanding the barriers and facilitators, and subsequently informing the selection of strategies to test to integrate those practices into different settings. One of the most common used is the EPIS model by Greg Ahrens and colleagues. And this is just one of those models, but I think it does a nice job of illustrating, there are multi-level factors associated with implementing these evidence-based practices. So aspects associated with the inner context, which is usually around organizational factors such as culture and climate, resources, leadership, as well as those factors at the outer setting level, broad funding, interorganizational networks, insurance availability. And some of these factors are consistent across the phases when you're focused on implementation. So the exploration phase, you're trying to work with stakeholders to understand what some of those interventions might be best suited for their context. Preparing to implement, so what are some of those trainings that might be actually needed? What are some of the materials? What are some of the networks and collaborative opportunities that are available? And then the actual implementation of those interventions. So again, what are some of those strategies to facilitate integration? And then finally, a really important point, sustainment. So to what extent are these interventions sustained and fully integrated in delivery settings once that research study has ended? There are over 70 different strategies that have been pulled from the literature as well as expert groups. These are the 9 categories of those. And you can see it depends on what those particular barriers are. Some of these strategies include technical assistance, which is an aspect that we usually consider for integration of practices into delivery settings. Some might include altering the incentive structure to the extent that that's feasible. Certainly in engaging consumers and end users and folks who are charged with actually delivering the care. Again, collaborative opportunities available, which is very important in this line of research. Training, supporting clinicians, so some of your audit and feedback, some of the quality improvement type of PDSA cycles are very common here, and developing those stakeholder relationships and interactive assistance. As I mentioned earlier, there are several different implementation outcomes that we focus on, and these may vary across that continuum. So acceptability and feasibility are more likely and more applicable in that early exploration phase. When you're preparing for implementation, you're trying to assess to what extent is this intervention a good fit, not with just patients in that target delivery setting, but also among the stakeholders and the providers who will be asked to deliver it. And the organizational culture and climate, does it fit with their mission statement, for example? The field is really trying to improve the extent to which it develops measures that are validated. These are just a couple examples here by Brian Weiner and colleagues at the University of Washington that has good validity. Several other outcomes are adoption, and this can be treated as a dichotomous variable, whether or not it was adopted, but doesn't always lead to full implementation. So it can be the intention to adopt, the initial decision, or an action trying to employ the intervention into the delivery setting, but again, doesn't necessarily lead to actual full integration. Fidelity is the degree to which the evidence-based practice or program is delivered as originally intended by the researchers who developed that practice or program. There's a really nice discussion in the literature around to what extent is fidelity necessary versus adaptation of the intervention components that's really needed to fit within the organizational setting, be a good fit within the particular provider that's delivering it. And then sustainability, and there's a really nice online interactive tool, the Program Sustainability Assessment Tool, which is a way to measure sustainability as well as helping to conceptualize what are some of the factors that one might consider when planning for sustainability once that particular study ends, to make sure that it's fully integrated and one can have the benefits of patient care over time. A lot of different study designs are employed in implementation science that we find across various research areas. Cross-sectional designs, your interrupted time series, variety of different randomized controlled trials, including your cluster RCTs. So oftentimes we're focused with these strategies at changing the behavior of healthcare providers who are nested within delivery settings, different types of clinics, health departments. And so we're randomizing at the organizational level, at the cluster level, rather than at the patient level. Pragmatic trials, which I'll mention in just a minute, your stepped wedge designs or your randomized rollout waitlist control designs, which have their benefits especially for very large trials in a lot of different organizations. Mixed methods, which is really helpful for understanding the process, so not just quantitative data about the level of fidelity with which something is being delivered, but also qualitative data to really understand that process by which implementation occurs. And qualitative data at the beginning to inform what adaptations might be necessary, to inform some of the aspects that are driving or facilitating sustainability and everything between. And then your hybrid effectiveness implementation designs, which have been highlighted in some of the presentations today and yesterday, these are particular designs that have been developed for implementation research. And there's the type 1, type 2, and type 3. So just to pause a minute here, talking about pragmatic trials, there's a lot of variability in the literature about what a pragmatic trial is. This is one way to conceptualize it, which really draws on some of the folks who have been involved in pragmatic trials for the past couple of decades, and really builds on the original conception of a pragmatic trial, which was first published by Schwartz and Lelouch in 1967. So these are 9 different domains. The PRESI2 tool here, which is online and available and part of the resource list, or if you just Google PRESI2, you'll find it. But it's really quite an in-depth and sophisticated way of thinking about and planning for trials that are more pragmatic or more explanatory, kind of on this 1 to 5 scale. And the important aspect that I would emphasize here is that this is supposed to be used as a tool in the design phase of the trial, and really a collaborative approach among everyone on the research team, including the stakeholder groups involved, in terms of how the trial should be designed based on the most important question that one is trying to answer. So trials that are considered to be more pragmatic, based on the PRESI2 here, are really trying to answer policy and practitioner-based questions, really real-world questions and applicability, versus those on the explanatory continuum, which is similar to your efficacy trials, really looking at mechanisms of change. So with that said, your hybrid effectiveness implementation designs, where effectiveness here is quite similar in conceptualization to pragmatic designs or approaches, it really looks at the clinical pathway and pipeline going from efficacy to effectiveness to dissemination and implementation. And so first proposed by Jeff Kern and colleagues, they said that why don't we take the opportunity when we're doing effectiveness trials on the intervention to embed some aspects of implementation in there, to accelerate that transition from effectiveness research to implementation research. So there are 3 different types here, which are a variation of their primary and secondary aims. Your type 1s are focused on testing the clinical intervention or evidence-based practice or program in, generally speaking, a broader population in various sites, with a secondary objective being trying to collect barriers and facilitators about that implementation process, to provide more information and be able to leverage that into a follow-up study, either a type 2 or a type 3, where you're testing different strategies to facilitate that integration. So some of those 70+ strategies, or the 9 categories, looking at what are the critical elements necessary to integrate that practice or program such that it is now standard of care. So just want to go over briefly some of the common implementation science questions that we see and some of the funding, some of the studies that have been funded. So this is one of the more common funding mechanisms that we have at NIH. It's the Dissemination and Implementation Research in Health. We have R03s, R21, and R01 mechanisms. And we are delighted that 20 NIH institutes and centers have signed on, the most that we've ever seen for this PAR. And we have a standing study section that reviews these grants across these different institutes and centers. So agnostic to the particular type of health domain, but really more focused on implementation. And the program announcement will be reissued next week with new numbers. These are just some of the select cancer grants that we have funded within our portfolio. You can see the variety here of looking at implementation of different types of interventions in different settings for different target patient populations. So looking at patient navigation in rural areas, scalability, which is a very important aspect of personal health records for survivors, and caregivers at pediatric cancer centers, and a hybrid type design looking at a mobile health system for colorectal cancer screening. We also have 8 different grant applications that PIs have been kind enough to share with us, and we have them posted on our website, some R21s and some R01s that have been funded within the past couple of years. So some of the emerging areas of interest that I would say we're particularly focused on within the PAR that will be released next week, as well as consistent with where we are as a field. I mentioned adaptation of practices and programs, and so really trying to conceptualize when that adaptation occurs, how much adaptation of that intervention can occur while we're still confident that it's actually going to have an impact on patient outcomes, and kind of that tension between fidelity and adaptation, and some guidelines and approaches for considering adaptation of those different components. Sustainability, as I mentioned, post-research studies. So once you've implemented or received funding to test strategies to integrate that practice or program into settings, what are some of the aspects that are associated with sustainability? 6 months after the research funding has ended for that implementation trial, 2 years after it has ended, what are some ways in which we can understand what those barriers are, and like the program, the sustainability tool, try to plan for that in advance. We're also interested in tailored implementation strategies. So rather than kind of throwing the kitchen sink at it and saying we're going to use these 10 different strategies, really trying to better understand in what context for which interventions are these strategies most applicable and most impactful. And then finally, as Lynn alluded to, this issue of de-implementation, which we see in cancer as well as other health areas. How do we kind of roll back, either remove from the system, decrease the frequency of or intensity with which the intervention is delivered, trying to get to the optimal aspect of care delivery. And this is the JCO that I published with my supervisor, David Chambers, and the former director of DCP at NCI, really trying to conceptualize in a phased approach what are some aspects that one might consider, not just for research, but from a practical approach, a practice-based approach. What are some of the aspects that should be considered, and then emphasizing this multi-level focus on what are some of those strategies that could be deployed and tested. Briefly, a couple resources here. We have different training programs. We have an archive of webinars on our website, and we have them monthly on different topics that are cancer-focused. Training and dissemination and implementation research and health, and then one specific to cancer. And Ruth Carlos may or may not remember or have even been asked, but she is a trainee in TIDERC this year, and I'm sure would be happy to give her opinion on how that program goes, and I'm happy to answer some questions as well. We have an annual conference in December here in the DC area, supported by NIH, Academy Health, AHRQ, PCORI, RWJF, and the VA. So a lot of different partners in the health area, public health and healthcare. We have over 1,300 attendees this past year, which is the most we've ever had. I'm happy to answer questions about this as well. The call for abstracts should be released in the next month or two. And then finally, a couple of textbooks and journals. The journal Implementation Science is really the main journal in the field. It's open access journal, and they publish protocols as well, if you're interested in that. And then these two textbooks, the second edition of the Dissemination and Implementation Research in Health book by Ross Brownson, Graham Kolditz, and Enola Proctor, which is across different health areas. And then one that we published this past year with David Chambers, Cindy Vincent, and myself, that's specific to cancer, that not only has chapters kind of talking about the foundational elements of implementation science, but also some case studies. And Melissa Simon, I believe you published with Harold Friedland as well on patient navigation. So with that, questions, comments, and we'll yield to Ann Geiger. Thank you.
Wynne, could you go back to the slide with the hybrid type 1, type 2, and type 3? And were any questions from the audience? Oh.
So I have a question about, you made the comment about fidelity versus adaptation, and I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because as you know, we're sort of immersed in a, I'm over here.
Hi, thank you.
We're sort of immersed in this, and we're finding in our study that you know about, that if we pushed on fidelity, we would not succeed. I mean, we really do have to adapt, or we know it won't happen. So could you say more about what we should be on the lookout for? Because we would certainly be squarely in the camp of fidelity has to take a back seat to acceptability and meaningful use clinically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think adaptation is increasingly recognized in community settings and delivery settings by the stakeholder organizations, policymakers, practitioners. I think it is really a necessary aspect of implementation. There are some interventions for which fidelity is really important and critical. So motivational interviewing that's delivered by different types of practitioners has a particular criteria at which below there's a balloon, which is, surprise. I was trying my best not to look at it, but it's a little distracting. So I think it's a necessary aspect. I think it depends on the intervention. There are some really nice articles that outline and try to plan for and look at what type of adaptations you are making, by whom, the delivery person, core components of the intervention, and trying to get a lot of that feedback, like you said, in the early aspect of intervention delivery and the implementation trial. And kind of that's where your key collaborators and stakeholders can provide input. We don't yet have kind of a cutoff point generally across different programs, but we wouldn't really anticipate that to occur, except for some of those like motivational interviewing. Thank you. Hybrid slide.
Yeah, so, and then my question is for Ann. And Elise Park and Jamie Ostroff's trial is a hybrid type 1, I think. And so my question is, for any hybrid trials, if any of our trials have a hybrid design from type 1 on, are they CCDR aligned, or does it depend? Because type 1 seems like it
yield
could
to Ann. Phone a friend.
This is my first comment, Lynn, in my, so I'm Ann Geiger, I'm the scientific director for CCDR. So my first comment, Lynn, is actually that a lot, if not most, of the implementation science work will fall within cancer care delivery, because you're really trying to move an intervention into standard practice, which is very much in our wheelhouse. And implementation science is incorporated into the research base RFA, both implicitly and explicitly, and I won't repeat that, but referencing some things Wynne said, we're very interested in multi-level work, so clinicians and systems, and Wynne talked about that a little bit. Wynne also mentioned de-implementation, so it's not just how do we do something that we know we should be doing, it's how do we stop doing something we know we shouldn't be doing. So I just wanted to give a little context. You've heard about 3 ECOG-ACRIN CCDR studies today, and I would argue that all 3 of them are either implementation science or preparatory to implementation science. So the financial burden study is looking at patients and trying to understand what their challenges are, and at some point there'll be an intervention tested, and then at some point we will want to roll that out into standard practice. The biomarkers study is actually a very interesting example because it's an organizational assessment. It's actually trying to figure out, do community practices face challenges in getting the tests done that need to be done to determine treatment? And then, of course, smoke-free that you've heard about several times during this meeting that has just opened is a very classic implementation science study. So you're doing these things whether you realize it or not. And so for the researchers out there, I want to make a couple of comments. Watching this all go on from NCI, there's a couple things that I notice as a former extramural scientist. So one of them is, if you are going to do a study like this in NCORE, it requires an enormous amount of flexibility. And if you want to know more about that, talk to Elise or Jamie. It really is different from the world a lot of us live in. And then it was interesting, I had these talking points, and Lynn made this point in a meeting yesterday. This is really community-based participatory research. Medical practices are the end users or the stakeholders that Wynne referred to. These are your people at the NCORE sites. Treat them like partners. Get them involved from the very beginning. And the reason is the next couple of things I'm going to suggest here. So when you're developing a concept or a grant, you really need to ask yourself, to what extent is this going to improve patient outcomes and well-being? And does it address disparities in care? So that's your significance piece. But you also need to ask yourself, do community-based clinicians, the people involved in NCORE, do they perceive that addressing this problem will improve patient outcomes and well-being? Another way to think about this is, will it address a problem that is encountered on a regular basis in community practice? And then there's the question of, is it realistic? And another way to think about that is, when you walk away as a researcher, is it something that the NCORE sites will be interested in continuing to do and able to continue to do? And that's not, doesn't have one answer. For every site you go to, the answer is going to be a little different. So just a couple of other observations. That's sustainability. Human subjects issues can get very tricky in pragmatic trials and in cluster randomized trials. It's really an emerging field, so it takes a little bit of negotiation and patience. And then I think the other thing we're hearing from a couple of our investigators who have implementation science studies going, people at the sites aren't always familiar with some of these designs and methods, and so you need to check that out a little bit and maybe provide training. Maybe not, but maybe. So I'm actually going to be quiet now, and I don't know where I see Heather. I don't know where Connie is. But I asked, oh, there's Connie way back there. So I asked Heather Keene from Metro Minnesota and Connie Shaponik from Western Michigan to just share a couple of points about their experience working on these studies at sites. So if you guys want to step to the microphone, don't be shy, Heather, you're closest.
I can share, in particular, I'll even take it a step further. I think a lot of times when we talk about the care delivery issues that the protocols are addressing, they have always resonated with the clinicians at the site, the medical oncologists and the navigators who perhaps help patients who are having financial difficulties. But where we really have concentrated a lot of our effort is reaching out to stakeholders at community-based programming. Actually, for example, with the financial burden studies, all three of them now, Cancer Legal Care is a volunteer group of lawyers in the community that have been serving this population for over 14 years. So it's been important to us to reach out to them when rolling out this type of protocol, because if anybody knows the population at risk, they do. And long story short, it turns out we had a recent news story with Channel 5 at length, investigative reporting featuring the financial burden studies. So that's an example of also working with the media. And then speaking of the smoke-free, another example where we've reached out to external stakeholders is they're called a Breath of Hope Lung Foundation. So they share, we really look for community-based programs that share our goal that the protocol is addressing. And at the end of the day, when you have a team of advocates or a very much respected community-based program arm in arm with you to roll out a study to a health system, they tend to listen. So that's where we've really shined and have found a lot of value working with them.
A few observations from our site, perhaps. I think, Anne, you hit it on the head in asking, is the question relevant and of interest to the community? Because our plates are very full and the menus are really full, and so it's hard to engage people if there's not already an interest in the things being asked. So we do a lot of work to prioritize and match studies with investigators, sites, et cetera. One thing, though, that I would strongly encourage anyone who's thinking of working with an NCORE to consider is work through your NCORE. Work with your leadership. We navigate these system waters every hour of every day. We have Switzerland emblazoned upon our chest and know who to call and what department to do the impossible and the unheard of. So really, when the conversations start in other places, it's really hard to get them back in. And in this world especially, a lot of the people who will be involved don't have time built into their clinical workflow to do this work. They're employed physicians, they're trying to meet their RVUs, they're trying to run the machine. This is all over and above and beyond. So we can help sometimes garnering system support for them to have time to breathe. When you plan conference calls and these think tanks to engage everybody, don't put them at 10:27 on the busiest clinical day of the week. Think about what's happening out in the neighborhood, because all of our calls for most of our studies happen during the day because that's convenient for research teams. The investigators can't be there, but people like us can. So if that's when the call needs to be there, let the research teams help. We can facilitate, we can help connect the dots, we can help clear schedules, we know, practice managers, et cetera, et cetera. So there are opportunities and ways to engage people, but engage them at the right time, in the right way, through the right system. And then my other comment, and I was really grateful that it was highlighted, was the fact that this is a lot about discovery and feasibility, and not just implementing, but figuring out how to implement the implementation. So Tracer, for example, my colleague Joan from Kalamazoo can speak to that more than I, but we spent a lot of time on SWOG S1415 CD and thought we had that nailed, figured out the site, figured out IS, had it all worked out, loaded, ready to go. But what we didn't realize was the downstream impact on the clinical flow and the screening that takes place. So we really had to stop and step back and start over. It took a long time. We were one of the last sites. Kept getting emails and phone calls from Scott Ramsey by the hour. What the heck are you people doing out there? But we're almost there. But I think the learning, the valuable part of that was the lessons learned. And I think one of the most important things we were able to do was share the lessons we were learning. So to build in time for the discovery and the feasibility and what are the barriers and how do we figure them out together, that may be some of the most important work that we do.